In Tekra Encore, Atlas stopped using melee weapons as a stat stick and finally got real exalted. This fundamentally changes how you mod him already, made even more significant by changes to his base stats too. So how do you punch with Atlas now? I'm TheKengineer, let's solve a practical problem. If you somehow don't yet have Atlas, you can trade for the Prime from other players or occasionally find it in Prime Resurgence. The base frame can be acquired from the circuit when it's in rotation, or by farming the mission unlocked with the Jordas Precept quest. Remember to bring a suitably modded Archon to kill the boss shooting its engines. Atlas's Landslide is his first ability, utilising the exalted melee Landslide Fists. Atlas charges forward to an enemy within range and punches it with such force that a shockwave hits every enemy around it too. Repeat cast will chain the effect into a big AoE with reduced energy cost. This AoE can pass through terrain, negating any concern for target placement. Using it couldn't be easier. Find enemies, cast one on a target, punch them into the next life. While the radius of the explosion is moddable by range, the range at which Atlas will lock onto a target is almost entirely fixed at 12 meters at max rank. The only exception to this is the augment Rubble Heap, a passive augment that enables Atlas to cast Landslide freely with twice the damage and twice the travel speed when he's above 1400 rubble. As it so happens, that double speed also doubles the targeting range, giving Atlas a 24 meter slide to land his punch. The damage of Landslide is at base 350, scaled by strength, Rubble Heap, and Landslide Fist modding. Previously, Atlas used to have a minimal 5% critical chance and status chance to work with. Now, D have buffed that to 35% critical chance and 15% status chance, on top of a 2.4 times critical multiplier. This is all in exchange for losing the option to use Arcane weapons to buff the base stats. Simply put, this means Atlas can achieve far more in terms of critical output without needing to rely on an Arcane weapon to cheat the stats in, or even Arcane Avenger's final critical chance. While the status chance is much lower than the critical chance, Atlas isn't without status output. With just Weeping Wounds, that 15% becomes 81%, making it pretty reliable at applying a single effect where needed. By design, Atlas is usually looking to kill enemies in 1 or 2 hits, rather than a prolonged battle with each of them. With that in mind, we can look through the melee arcanes to filter down the build options. Melee Afflictions wants to apply a whole load more status effects when knocking down or flinging enemies. While Atlas can achieve this, usually enemies at the point of being ragdolled should also be dead, making this of limited use. Even with beefy survivors, applying additional status effects to single targets can only go so far. Melee Doughty has no puncture to work from. Melee Duplicate demands Atlas not use his critical chance to the fullest, which is a non-starter. Melee Fortification offers temporary armor to a frame which can generate its own passively. Melee Retaliation requests a sizable amount of shields, yet Atlas is a health tank. Melee Vortex wants to scoop up enemies, but Atlas already obliterates a sizable AoE. Which all leaves us with either Melee Exposure or Melee Influence. Exposure grants a lot of corrosive damage, and Atlas will be casting plenty to trigger and maintain the Arcane. For a pure boost to direct damage, this would be correct, especially in low enemy density missions. However, for higher densities, Influence is the better choice. You don't need fancy math to prove this, you only need to consider the circumstances. If Atlas can one-shot an enemy without Exposure equipped, then Exposure being equipped does nothing. Influence will also not trigger as the enemy died instantly. If Atlas can one-shot with Exposure but not with Influence, then Atlas can remove enemies in that relatively narrow band more rapidly with Exposure. It's relatively narrow as it's easy to mod Atlas with at least 150% element already, meaning Exposure would give less than double damage. Enemy tanking missions varies by much more than double between units, so this scenario is pointing at a small case of enemies and mission levels. If Atlas can neither one-shot with Exposure nor with Influence, then Exposure brings the single target closer to death directly, but you're still in multiple cast territory. When Atlas fails to one-shot, a reliably electric modded build can turn on Melee Influence and use that to start slamming all nearby enemies with strong electric procs. As Landslide is itself an AoE, the greater the enemy density, the greater the effect. For each additional enemy that doesn't die while receiving an electric proc, every surviving enemy in range will be taking another 50% of Landslide's damage instantly and every second for the proc duration. Just 2 electric procs will spread more damage instantly than exposure would have applied, and it only scales from there. It really comes down to the logic that if enemies are already dead, exposure doesn't help. If enemies are not dead, influence hits for more damage to greater range than exposure, unless there are no other nearby survivors. Use influence unless you know you'll have just one target to keep punching. Seeing as influence is the broadly correct answer, this determines the rest of the setup. Electric elemental modding, hybrid crits and status, and some base damage to back it all up. While focusing on electric mods does mean missing out on potentially higher elemental damage bonuses, I've not seen a situation yet where it's been a real downside. If you have primed faction mods and are happy to use them, slot them in. For a more generalist approach, I suggest using Galvanized Elementalist. While the loss of direct damage is noticeable, it'll make any influence triggers that much more reliable and effective. It's again relying on the logic that if enemies are not dying, the electric spread can immediately fix that. Gladiator Might is almost always more powerful than Organ Shatter for Atlas modded this way, unless you're using a high strength Raffle Advance and no critical damage Archon shards. In terms of a subsume to boost this, Landslide being a melee would suggest Raffle Advance as an immediate winner. However, while it does provide a very strong upfront bonus, it comes at the cost of only buffing your melee crits. If you want to intersperse Landslide with any other weapon, boost your allies or companion, or get significantly more damage again out of status effects, Raw steps well above Raffle Advance. It's not even a 7% reduction in direct damage with my setup, even if using a full set of Talforged Crimson Shards for melee critical damage. Which brings me to the full build for Atlas. Thanks to Rubble Heap, Atlas can have entirely free casting of Landslide once he's reached the required rubble. Thanks to Path of Statues, Atlas can maintain that rubble from the very same cast of Landslide, so long as Atlas remains in approximately the same area to get enemies to walk into the path. Explode enemies with his wand, leave a petrifying trail, circle around and repeat, all while scooping up shattered remains of enemies as fuel for the process. If Atlas ever takes any health damage, the scooped up rubble will heal him, triggering Archon Intensify. This build shines in being a high range, highly reliable obliterator. Atlas is immune to damage during the casting of Landslide, so should be very survivable in addition to the rubble armor and adaptation. There is, however, the matter of getting to that point. Atlas does not start missions at 1400 rubble, meaning no free casts of Landslide. Atlas also doesn't start with well-placed petrification zones, meaning no free rubble. He needs to use Petrify to get started reasonably. Even before efficiency woes, that's a 75 energy cast cost raised to 116.25 by Blind Rage. That said, overinvesting into efficiency to get started will drastically lower his maximum output. The best solution I found to this startup issue is to use Arcane Steadfast to get occasional free ability casts, and to use a Beast Companion with Duplex Bond. The Beast can be modded for high damage to semi-reliably get kills with its claws, enabling energy drops via Duplex Bond. A low efficiency cast to Petrify will immediately trigger Duplex Bond, giving you that second beast roaming about and making energy happen for you. An Adarza combat modded like this will grant energy, crit chance enhancement, and a solid fighting companion boosted by Atlas's innate health and armor. You can go for other beasts too, but it's nice to throw Atlas even more crit most of the time. You can go about this in other ways, such as Xenaric's Wellspring or Galaxian's Photon Overcharge. It's a matter of what's available and desirable to you. The point is, you need to petrify enemies at first, then kill them with Landslide preferably to build up that starting combo and rubble. After the first few rotations of that, you'll be able to hand out free casts of instant nap time to any enemy. For linear missions, where you don't stay around a single kill box, Path of Statues loses its place. Instead, a more robust energy economy is necessary to enable use of Landslide and Petrify throughout a mission. For that, I've taken the route of removing Path of Statues for fleeting expertise, Blind Rage for transient fortitude, Arcane Intensify for prime continuity, and Overextended for vitality. We end up with a small loss to strength, a big drop in range, but an overwhelmingly cheaper cast cost. Petrify comes down from 116.25 energy to just 30. Rubble Heap is still a worthy pickup for the double damage, double range, and zero cast cost of Landslide when sufficient rubble is acquired. It's not like Atlas can afford to skip on rubble, considering it's his healing, armor, and comes from Petrify, which also controls and weakens enemies. For the cost of a mod slot, we get to make full use of that passive. For the low density setup, you could leave Landslide Fists as they are. For more power, switch into a faction specific approach with your choice of element. Swap out Influence for exposure, and swap Elementalist for a faction mod if one exists, or another element if it doesn't. You can consider Prime Reach too. On the high density build, Prime Reach is a waste due to already having a large range. For low density however, Primed Reach offers enough of an increase to be notably larger AoE, disproportionately benefiting the earlier punches due to their smaller base range. That means a final low density setup may look more like this, dispensing of status and influence for that heavy hitting, higher range approach. The goal here is to minimize the number of casts needed per target, recognizing the reduced opportunity for multi-hits and reduced Warframe range. Move from room to room, petrifying groups as you see them, and shattering them cluster by cluster. Archon shards are rather useful on Atlas, and are best as Crimson shards for extra melee critical damage. The energy max requirement for Violet shards is not ideal, given it would take a mod slot to achieve the bonus, with very few mods on either build worth sacrificing that way. Stick to the Crimsons. For Focus School, I recommend Lazy Mode and Aramon, or energy boosting with Zeneric. Don't forget your primary and secondary dexterity arcanes if you choose Zeneric to help maintain combo. All told, this gives you two powerful setups to take down enemies through pretty much punching alone. Either you rock the high density setup like in Steel Path Survival, or roam around with the high efficiency setup when enemies aren't cosplaying sardines. I hope this gives you all the power you're looking for in Atlas's Landslide after the pseudo-exalted changes. I've not touched on his fourth intentionally in this video and may cover that at a later date. For now, a big thank you to all the channel supporters, and as always, make rocks, land shocks, and fight well, Tenno.